problem for me wasn't growth or opportunity or even marketing. The problem wasn't my brand. The real problem for myself was that growth had introduced complexity faster than the clarity. And complexity has a way of hiding what's true. Clarity isn't a destination, it's a discipline. Because last year, I found myself asking a question I never expected. When did everything get so complicated? Not bad or broken, just straight up complicated. The business was moving forward, opportunities were showing up, revenue was growing, and people were reaching out. And so from the outside, everything looked good. But I started asking myself, why did all the important decisions start to feel harder to make? Why was it becoming more difficult to explain what I did? Why did I keep changing how I talked about my business? Why did I feel like I was working harder to gain confidence instead of gaining confidence from the work? I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I knew something felt off. And if you've ever felt that tension in your own business, I think you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. My name is Freddie Castro. I help founders and leaders find clarity and build brands that actually reflect who they are. And over the years, I've noticed a pattern. The businesses that struggle with clarity aren't usually struggling with business. In fact, they're often the successful ones, the established ones. They're growing and have momentum. They're the ones that have opportunities. And that's what makes it a little bit deceptive, because when growth starts to create friction, most of us assume we're dealing with some marketing problem or sales problem or a messaging problem. I know that's what I thought, but what I eventually discovered was something completely different. At first, I thought I needed better systems. The business was evolving, so naturally I thought, start to build systems. Build better workflows, structure, process, and don't get me wrong, systems do matter. But the more I worked on the systems, the more I realized the friction wasn't operational for me. It was directional. The issue wasn't that I couldn't manage what I was building. The issue was that I wasn't completely sure what I was building anymore. And that's a very different problem. So then I thought maybe I needed a better offer. Maybe I need to refine my services, choose a different niche, reposition myself. And for a while, I chased a lot of those questions, but every answer I got seemed to create 3,000 more questions, because the deeper issue wasn't the offer. The deeper issue was that I hadn't stopped long enough to understand what really changed for me. Not in the market, in me. The way I thought had changed over the years. The kind of work I wanted to do had changed. The people I wanted to serve had changed. But I was still trying to make decisions using assumptions that belonged to a previous version of myself. Then I started wondering if maybe it was a branding problem. Maybe I needed a better website, clearer messaging, or a new visual identity. And as someone who helps people with those things, that's a dangerous assumption sometimes, because sometimes a better website helps, and messaging might help, and even a rebrand might help, but it's not always. And that's when I started noticing something, a pattern that showed up in my own business. It was a pattern that I now see in a lot of businesses and organizations. The businesses that feel most confused are rarely lacking opportunities. They're actually just drowning in them. Think about what happens when a business starts working. You start to gain experience, you gain confidence, the relationships grow, the network gets bigger, opportunities get bigger, and every opportunity feels legitimate. You could serve this audience, you could launch that service, you could explore this market, you could say yes to that partnership, and for a while that's super exciting. But eventually something happens. The business gets bigger, and somehow it becomes harder to understand. The pitch gets longer, the website pages grow, the explanation becomes more complex, and the decisions slow down. And what used to feel really, really clear for you isn't anymore. Not because you're failing, but because complexity has entered the picture. And complexity changes everything for a business. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to realize this. The problem for me wasn't growth or opportunity or even marketing. The problem wasn't my brand. The real problem for myself was that growth had introduced complexity faster than the clarity. and complexity has a way of hiding what's true. When you're moving super fast, it's easy to mistake activity for progress. It's easy to confuse options for direction. It's super easy to assume that because the business is growing, clarity grows with it. But I find that to be completely not true. In fact, sometimes I think growth is the very thing that exposes where clarity was never fully defined in the first place. And once I saw that pattern in my own business, I started to see it everywhere. Not just in the businesses that were struggling to launch, but the businesses that were established and succeeding. These were organizations that have been around for a while. These were founder-led businesses, consultancies, agencies, professional service firms, you name it. These organizations had grown into complexity faster than they had grown into clarity. And over time, I started noticing 3 places where growing businesses and organizations almost always lose clarity. The first is opportunities. This one's a little tricky because opportunities don't always feel dangerous. They feel exciting and exhilarating. You know, a new client asks if you can help with something adjacent to what you've already done. A partner introduces you to a new market, or this new revenue stream happens, or this new service makes sense for you. And because you're capable of doing it all, you say yes. And then you say yes again. And then next thing you know, you're becoming the yes man. And you realize you've built a business around everything you can do instead of everything that you should do. I've been there. I try to be everything to everybody. Most founders have. And the challenge isn't that the opportunities are bad. The challenge is that every yes makes the business slightly harder to understand. And eventually you wake up and realize your business no longer has a clear sense of purpose and heart. You might have a collection of good ideas, but that's a different thing. The second place businesses lose clarity is in how they explain themselves. This is usually where the symptoms start to become more visible. So the website starts to get longer, the service list gets bigger, the pitches become more complicated. You know, simple questions suddenly require complicated answers. What do you do? Who do you help? Why should someone choose you? Questions that used to take 1 sentence to answer now take 30 minutes. And what's interesting is that founders often assume here that they have a messaging problem. But messaging is actually a downstream issue. It's a downstream issue from a clarity issue. When the business itself becomes difficult to define, communication becomes difficult. You can't consistently communicate what hasn't been clearly defined, and that's why rewriting the website or the pitch doesn't solve the problem. That actually just reveals the problem. The third place businesses lose clarity is through exceptions. This might be one of the most dangerous things, because exceptions feel reasonable in the moment. Oh, this project's different, or this client's really unique. This opportunity is too good to pass up. And sometimes that may be true, but over time, enough exceptions create confusion. The business starts drifting slowly, and the team isn't sure what fits anymore, and the founder isn't even sure what to prioritize. Decision making slows down because every decision feels like a new decision, and there's no filter, there's no framework, no core definition guiding what belongs and what doesn't. That's exhausting. Not because you're working harder, but because you're deciding harder too. For me, the turning point wasn't a better strategy. It wasn't discovering some revolutionary framework. It was slowing down long enough to ask a few honest questions. What do I really want to be known for? Who am I uniquely positioned to help? What kind of work creates energy instead of drains it? What's true now that wasn't true 3 years ago? And maybe the most important question of all to ask yourself, what is the North Star and the purpose and the heart of my business? Because once I started answering that question, a lot of the other decisions became easier. And then some opportunities became obvious yeses. And then there were clear no's. Direction and messaging became clearer. The business became clearer, and not because I found a shortcut, but because I finally created a space to reflect and decide what that was. I think a lot of founders assume clarity is something you figure out once. You know, you discover it in the early days and you carry it forever, but that's not been my experience. Clarity isn't a destination, it's a discipline, because every season of growth introduces new complexity and new layers, and it requires a deeper understanding of who you are, not just as a business, but as a leader, as a founder, as a person. The businesses that remain clear aren't the ones that avoid growth, they're the ones that create enough space to keep rediscovering what's true about themselves. So if you're feeling that friction right now, if decisions feel heavier than they used to, if explaining your business feels harder, if growth has somehow made things feel more complicated and confusing, I want you to consider the possibility that you're not dealing with a marketing problem or a sales problem or a content problem or a branding problem. You might be dealing with a clarity problem. Clarity problems don't get solved by moving faster. They get solved by paying attention, reflecting, defining, creating enough space to understand what's really true. Because growth will always create complexity. That's the price of progress. But clarity is what keeps complexity from becoming confusion. And sometimes the next season of growth doesn't begin with moving faster, it begins with slowing down. Just long enough to remember what's true about you. So if this conversation resonates with you at all, I'd encourage you to spend some time this week with one question. What is the purpose and the heart of your business? What's the thing that makes everything else tick? And if you're having a hard time answering that question, don't ignore it. That uncertainty might be pointing you to the work that needs to be done. And if you'd like help navigating that conversation, I'd love to talk. You can learn more about Minor Creative and schedule a fit call with us using the links in the description below. I'd love to connect. Remember, the gold is in who you are, not what you do.